It gets really, really scary when all of a sudden Airbnb says, okay, it's not really necessarily your business. We're not going to let you take these guests and leave the platform with them.
Welcome to Behind the Stays, a podcast that shares the stories behind your favorite boutique hotels, short-term rentals, and hospitality brands, and the hosts, operators, and entrepreneurs who've brought them to life. Every Tuesday and Friday, you'll meet the military veterans, the retired flight attendants, the tech entrepreneurs, the school teachers, the single moms, the hoteliers, and real estate investors who are all, in their own unique ways, shaping the future of travel and hospitality. Discover how these visionaries from all over the world have built stunning landscape hotels in the mountains, designed bohemian bungalows on the beach, erected eclectic, off-grid, nature-immersed escapes, and so much more. Behind the Stays is brought to you by Journey, a first-of-its-kind loyalty program that brings together an alliance of the world's top independently owned and operated stays and allows travelers to earn points and perks on boutique hotels, vacation rentals, tree houses, ski chalets, glamping experiences, and so much more. And I'm your host, Zach Boozy-Cruz, head of the Journey Alliance. All right, friends, without further ado, enjoy the show. It's all that the STR gurus of LinkedIn and X have been able to talk about over the last week, and that is Airbnb's updated off-platform policy and what it means for the future of the hospitality industry, especially for entrepreneurs in the short-term rental space. So in this conversation, I wanted to invite two friends who've read the policy thoroughly and who have also talked with the folks at Airbnb to seek clarity on what these rules, whether new or not so new, as we'll talk about in a moment, actually all mean. Today, I'm joined by Arthur Colker, founder of StayFi, and Philip Kennard, CEO of FutureStay, to unpack one of the most talked about moves in short-term rental history as of late, Airbnb's newly sharpened off-platform and fee transparency policy. Depending on who you ask, it's either a long overdue consumer protection measure or a strategic power grab designed to lock in lifetime guest value at all costs. Arthur and Philip bring firsthand insights and a healthy dose of reality to a conversation that's been fueled by fear, misinformation, and a whole lot of LinkedIn hot takes. Hot takes that were, in many respects, written by ChatGPT. In this episode, we dive deep into why this new policy might actually be less revolutionary than most hosts realize, and what's really different this time. We talk about the two buckets Airbnb is focused on: protecting guests, good, and protecting their margins, more complicated. We talk about how vague language, selective enforcement, and the threat of guest complaints create a new dynamic that hosts must navigate. We talk about why operators building brands off-platform shouldn't panic, but should pay attention to regulatory wins, especially if you're in Europe. We also talk about what might come next: services marketplaces, tighter control over payments, and the looming specter of pricing parity. If you're a rentalpreneur, a professional operator, or someone who's just interested in understanding the latest development in Airbnb's sharpened policy, this is a must listen. All right, friends, without further ado, get ready to hear from Arthur and Philip from StayFi and FutureStay, respectively. All right, Arthur, Philip, welcome to the show. How are you both doing this fine Monday morning? Arthur, we'll start with you.
Doing great.
I'd like to hear it. Philip, how about you?
Awesome. It was a nice sunny weekend here in tri-state area, so I'm pumped. Just lost my video. Okay, I'm back. Good to see you. And thanks for Zach. Thanks for having me. And Arthur, good to see you again.
It is an absolute pleasure to have you both on, and I appreciate you guys both making time for this very, very last minute. So Airbnb released a new off-platform policy, and depending on who you talk to, it is new or it is not that new. But regardless of whether it's new or not that new, it's been the topic of public discourse, at least on LinkedIn, at least on STR LinkedIn, over the last several days. And both of you, in your own rights, have responded to sort of your perspective on this change and or lack thereof. Maybe you call it a refinement, if you will. So I wanted to have you both on to kind of talk through that. But I thought for listeners who might not be as up to speed on what it is that we're even talking about here, I would sort of quickly recap this policy and why folks are discussing it either again or depending on who you talk to, or for the first time. So Really, what I want to do for our conversation today is talk about Airbnb's newly sharpened, is the word I picked here, off-platform and fee transparency policy that's really scheduled, according to their latest release, to go into full enforcement on May 10th. So we're just 20 days or so away from this enforcement. And then in one stroke, this update outlaws 5 host behaviors. So first and foremost, moving, and that's in quotes, right? Moving current, future, or repeat bookings off of Airbnb. So this includes adding a link, a discount, or message that nudges a guest to cancel and then rebook or extend a stay or come back to book direct with you next time. Number 2 is hidden or late stage fees, every mandatory charge. So cleaning, pet, HOA, utilities, any other sort of like a random fee that you might have must be an official fee field or baked into the nightly rate so that the checkout price is truly final. They don't want consumers, they don't want guests being hit with fees after booking that they weren't expecting. Number 3, off-platform payments. There are some like narrow carve outs here for what Airbnb calls API connected operators and hotels that are collecting incidentals. But other than that, all money must flow through Airbnb's processor. Number 4, harvesting guest data for marketing or any purpose unrelated to the stay is now banned. Again, we can dive into that. I'm really interested, especially on Arthur's perspective there. And then last but certainly not least, requiring third-party apps or websites to unlock the door unless the tool is optional or legally mandated. So there was several different startups that were working on technology that enabled guests to sort of unlock from their phone. Oftentimes you were required to download that app in order to access your unit. Airbnb says that's no anymore. You can't do that. So why does all of this matter? Why are we about to have this discussion today? Well, in the same time that this is happening, whether this is, again, a newly sharpened policy or something that's always been there, but just is surfacing once again, is that repeat bookings have really kind of become the lifeblood of professional STR operators, especially those who are branded collections of stays. Many hosts now drive 30 to 50% of their stays directly if they're a professional operator. So by fencing repeats inside this walled garden, Airbnb defends a up to 14% take rate. They secure guest data for future products like their host marketplace, which a lot of people are kind of questioning and curious to see how that evolves. And also ultimately, this aligns with regulators cracking down on what they call junk fees. So there's lots of concerns here. Obviously, brand anxiety, right? A lot of folks have spent a lot of time. You think of the Avant Stays of the world. You think of the Portoros of the world, the other kind of big professional operators kind of building these brands. More and more of those individuals are booking direct. So this is a concern for folks. There's concern about this being an unfair playing field now, right? Between larger operators, folks who might have these software connected PMS systems that are approved, and other smaller operators that might not be able to afford and or choose to pay for these larger PMS systems. There's operational friction, which is a concern, right? Smart lock vendors, concierge apps, and guest experience tools have to now kind of rethink their workflows because of this. Also, you could argue that this, the ability to unlock the door from your phone was this frictionless experience, and now we're going back to lockboxes is what some people think. And then last but certainly not least, folks are wondering if this is just kind of a regulatory smokescreen, right? Airbnb frames the change as consumer protection, but critics see a margin defense move wrapped in fee transparency rhetoric. So that was a long kind of summary of kind of what I think is worth talking about today. Thank you to the listeners for being patient with me as I got through all of that. I want to start actually with you, Philip, and just get your sort of overall reactions. What about kind of what I just shared either resonates or doesn't resonate with your reading of the policy? I know that you have spent some time actually talking to folks at Airbnb as well. And so would love just kind of your high level reaction to this policy. And then Arthur, we'll go to you.
Sure. So yeah, I think that was an excellent setup. I kind of break the policy down into 2 buckets. The first are kind of consumer or guest protection buckets, right? That includes specifically making sure that there is fee transparency, making sure that all the fees associated with accessing a property are laid out in the listing itself, not just in free text form, but in the listing, so that a guest, that a consumer can make an accurate decision about how much it's actually going to cost to stay in a listing. Sure. Forget the regulatory perspective, just like best practices, let the consumer know what they're going to buy and how much it's going to cost, right? The second is specifically, the second bucket is really more around the protectionist nature of Airbnb saying, look, we are the ones that paid to acquire this guest. We want to hold on to this guest, and we do not want you as the short term rental host or owner to build a relationship that would reduce our potential lifetime value from this guest. Those are the two big buckets. The I think what I'm seeing in terms of discourse is that there's a tremendous amount of concern about both buckets, right? Specifically, and I can tell you a little bit of my opinion and a little bit of what I'm hearing from Airbnb. I think Airbnb, and I think a lot of the kind of voices in the industry that are going to be impacted by this, respect the reality that we want to deliver. We as an industry, as a short-term rental industry, want to deliver a seamless and transparent experience to guests. We don't want to surprise guests with fees. We don't want operators to have kind of crazy last minute resort fees or property access fees that drive the industry down as a whole. And we also don't want to require guests to, in order to access the property at a minimum, have to download apps and do complex things, right? We do, however, also want our operators to be able to stand on their own 2 feet, and we want them to be able to own and build their own businesses. And so I think the general sentiment in the industry right now is we kind of understand bucket one. We understand that we want transparency and we want access to be simple for guests. But bucket two is where things start getting really scary. Yeah. Because it is an industry that is already, especially in the rentalpreneur segment, the segment that I work with at FutureStay, kind of 1 to 5 unit owner or manager, which represents close to 80% of the industry supply, right? And more than that in terms of hosts. They are very dependent on Airbnb, and Airbnb does a great service for them and helps them build their business. But it gets really, really scary when all of a sudden Airbnb says, okay, it's not really necessarily your business. We're not going to let you take these guests and leave the platform with them. So I think that's the way that I'd break it down in terms of what you're seeing in terms of, people's concern about bucket one versus bucket two.
Yeah. Very well said. Arthur, what are your kind of high level takes? And then feel free to respond to anything that Philip just shared as well.
Yeah, I mean, I guess some of the characterization I don't totally agree with for several reasons. I think number one is there's very little new here. It's actually less restrictive than the old policy in some regards. I think many people just probably never read the old policy, so the new one seems shocking to them. But the old policy had some additional language that was actually more restrictive that we can talk about. Um, and there's a ton of exceptions in here. And I think a lot of people have read the headline policies, but didn't go ahead and read the exceptions that are laid out underneath. And so, I think the off, we can go through each one if you want.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but from my perspective, like there's very little that's changed. The only substantially new part was about failing to disclose fees and forcing everything through Airbnb's payment processor. That's really the only new thing here. That's substantially different than the old policy.
What on that note, Arthur, because I've heard a couple other people say similar things, right? And I trust those of you who've been in the industry a lot longer than I have on sort of like your thorough reading of the old versus new policy. I guess the question is why, right? Like why come out with a new policy then, right? Like and why now, right? So beyond sort of the obvious sort of revised policy, like what do you think is actually going on here?
Yeah. So just to like break it down, the current, future, or repeat bookings off of Airbnb is essentially the same. They did remove one line that I think was very vague, which was actually the most restrictive language, which was there was a line in the old policy that said asking or encouraging guests to book outside of Airbnb for repeat or future bookings. They got rid of that. And I think that could be for several reasons, but then the new policy is very focused on moving bookings off of Airbnb, as in you cannot divert existing bookings or people in the process of booking to another website, your own or another OTA, which is very much in their interests and makes a lot of sense, right? But they actually got rid of the language that you couldn't tell people about booking off platform for future stays, which I think they obviously knew many, many people were doing anyways, which also goes back to the other issue around this policy is many parts of it are probably intentionally vague and very challenging to enforce in a practical manner.
Yeah.
the failing to disclose reservation fees, I think that's very regulatory based, just because we actually have a lot of in the US, and I'm sure the same is in the EU, more rules and restrictions around you must disclose the full price at the point of checkout. And then obviously there are some ancillary benefits for Airbnb to direct more payments through their platform than other third party platforms. Same for reservation fees. Obviously, they have a little more nuance on all of these because they have more hotel customers. So they have like these HOA hotel carve outs, things like that. And then the contact information part that you read, I think, is interesting because who decides what's related or unrelated to the stay? I mean, that's in itself extremely vague, right?
Yeah.
And that part has considerable carve outs and exemptions for guests can request, or in my opinion, opt in for alternative forms of communication. And all of that language is essentially the same as before. And when you talk about kind of this rentalpreneur segment, I think it's interesting for all the, none of the large brands we work with ask about this policy or the policy changes. It's mostly definitely smaller hosts or smaller professional operators who probably were not familiar with the old policy and are now concerned and asking questions about it. But from our standpoint, at least in what we do, there's nothing substantially that has changed in the policy.
Yeah. So you don't, and Philip, I want to bring you in here about. Let's talk about sort of the marketing component here, right? The language around you can't market to guests in any way that encourages them to perform any activity off platform, right? Is essentially what Airbnb is getting at here. Obviously, that is very open to interpretation. Right?
I don't totally agree with that characterization either. I don't think that's what the policy
Yeah,
says.
I think
But
to that
anyways,
point, Arthur, right? Like Arthur has a
yeah,
really good point here, which is the new policy is very narrow in scope, and they use intentionally crafted words that are vague, but they leave intentional vagueness on the table. So they're specifically referring to moving bookings off of the platform, current or future bookings. And so with that, literally, if you want to literally break down what can move mean, move can mean there has to be a booking that is being considered to be on the platform in some way, shape, or form to move it off of the platform, right?
Yeah.
If I'm having a conversation with you today via Airbnb's messaging about a future booking, hey, my family and I are going to stay this weekend, and we're considering staying next year too, that could be construed as moving. But if I'm just having a conversation about this booking and then I come stay with you, right? And let's use another one of the exceptions that Arthur points out, which is this is a new exception, which I think is really creative. They make it very clear, this used to be unclear, that if the guest requests to be communicated with in a different channel other than Airbnb's messaging, that's permissible, right? And also, if a guest is not moving an existing booking, that is theoretically, it's no longer directly prohibited, right? So it does open up a number of kind of back channels to be able to market your own property without breaking the letter of the law in the policy.
Sure.
I think that is a really big distinction because before they used more vague language like marketing, and now we're talking specifically about moving bookings, and kind of a really narrow read of that would allow a lot of marketing behavior to actually be permissible.
Yep. Yeah, it's interesting. So just to read directly from the policy here too, right? So soliciting guests for their email, their mailing address, or other communication channels using the Airbnb messaging system or email alias after booking is prohibited. So I mean, you could read that as like you just can't ask for an email address of the guest through Airbnb's email system, which I mean they typically do a pretty good job of blocking.
they prohibit that. They prohibit that for a long
years.
time. So.
And I just on that point, I had a
Yeah.
conversation about that exact line, right, with Airbnb, and they were very clear that that line should be read exactly as it's written. That doesn't mean that you can't have a guest book or a sign-up form that's in your property or any other way of collecting contact information. It just means that you cannot do it through the existing channels that they provide, the mechanisms they provide, asterisk, unless the guest requests it.
Yeah.
So I think to your point, Arthur, I think a lot of people are seeing this policy. They've heard about the policy. They probably haven't read this exact policy still. They're hearing the discourse about the policy and they're getting worried and they're getting frustrated. I think the reality is there is a lot of this policy is really centered around guest protection and trying to make sure that the fees are transparent for listings. And like, I don't know about you guys, that's a win, right? Like, I think it's totally legitimate to have all the fees visible. I also, and I'm going to put on my future looking glasses here. Airbnb they're building up experiences, right? Experiences are for the distinction between an experience and a service would be an experience is something that is provided by a different person than the host, and it's not associated with the property. We all know that they're going to build a services platform or a services tool. Well, if experiences are for people that are not the host, what do we think services are for? Let's guess. I don't have any inside information here. My guess is that's probably going to be provided by the host, and it's probably going to be a way of the host collecting additional fees and so on. So this is probably a little bit of a precursor to saying, oh, well, now we've released a tool and a new set of APIs as well along with it that allow you to sell services through the Airbnb platform that'd be akin to what currently some people are able to do that are software connected, not through the Airbnb platform. So Airbnb can regulate them, they can report on them, and they can monetize them. That's kind of, I think, what the writing on the wall about the fee section of this is. It's in preparation for the other shoe to drop there for the services marketplace.
Yeah. Were you going to add something to that, Arthur?
Oh, I was going to say, like, I don't have a good, like, actual understanding of what percentages of Airbnb listings are software connected versus not. But, I think Airbnb's edge obviously is their volume of non-software connected hosts, because that's their unique inventory. Because if it's software connected, they're probably listing in other platforms. And so obviously they want to keep people in their walled garden and not have them become software connected hosts and then distribute their inventory elsewhere. So I see that as like very much, how can we continue to become like the sole place that you'd want to list your listings? And I definitely see that is the direction they're moving in with some of these new offerings that they're probably coming out with in the relative near future.
It wasn't that anything was wrong. No, not really. It was just, I don't know, life. The kids were young, so full of life and life, but always needing more. Their careers were oh so demanding, and it always felt like saying no was just never an option. And somewhere in between it all, they had misplaced each other. The bickering had become more frequent, the patience thinner, vulnerability a rare guest, romance something that they promised that they'd get back to eventually, but eventually never came. Until here. At first, it was just a drink at the lobby bar. Its design so effortlessly intimate, it made conversation feel natural again. Then a slow walk through the garden, up to their handcrafted safari tent, where a cellist played a song that neither of them recognized, but somehow felt like home. And then, without thinking, their hands found each other. Without effort, without expectation. And suddenly, they were laughing, like they had on a second date at the coffee shop downtown that no longer existed. They were complaining about each other's mothers like they had on the cobblestone street in Rome under St. Peter's shadow. It wasn't an escape from reality. It was, in fact, their truest reality. It was them. At Journey, we're building a collection of stays that inspire reconnection. Do you know a hotel, a treehouse, a ski chalet, or other soulful property that has inspired you to reconnect? If so, share it with me at zach@journey.com. Philip, I want to ask you, since you've been talking with them too, I want more clarity around the timing of all of this, right? Because from my perspective, right, over the last 5 years, obviously there's been kind of this huge boom in operators. There's been a huge boom in what I would just call like branded collections, for lack of a better term, of these brands that have emerged and command, quite frankly, incredible percentages of direct bookings. Instagram is their number one source of new guest acquisition, right? And most of them, if not all of them, that I know anyways, are still on Airbnb, but Airbnb continues to make a smaller and smaller, make up a smaller percentage of the overall pie of their bookings today. And many of them, right, a core objective of theirs anyways, is to eventually go off platform, not just Airbnb. This is the same of any OTA. We'll see. That's what they say. I don't know if I truly believe that. It's an incredible discovery tool. Why wouldn't you want to list on Airbnb? Great. If you can command all these direct bookings from Instagram, wonderful. The OTAs are still incredible discovery channels, if nothing else. So I'm just curious again about the timing of all of this, because we've seen over the last 5 years, I think that the industry has dramatically changed. Again, you guys have a closer read on this than even I do. Maybe I have a biased perspective as well because of the people that I bring onto the show. But point being, why now? Why is now the time for a sharpened policy, if you will?
Yeah, I think just to put some numbers into perspective, or put the industry into perspective, Arthur, you just mentioned a moment ago, it's very difficult to know what the exact number of software connected hosts are on Airbnb. That's true. I don't know that number directly either. What I do know is if you look at the industry from the top down, specifically for Airbnb, now these numbers are fairly transferable to the industry at large, but not 100% one-to-one. Less than 0.6% of all hosts on Airbnb have more than 20 listings. So not less than 6%, like less than 0.6%. So not even 1% of all Airbnb hosts have 20 listings, right? Less than 5% of hosts, or sorry, less than 7% of hosts have more than 10 listings. And then only about 15% of hosts have more than 6 listings. So we're talking about just for Airbnb supply. Now, I know one's going to say, okay, that's great, but what about by number of properties managed? What percentage of their supply is that? Large hosts with 20 plus properties make up less than 10% of Airbnb supply. That's typically where you find the most software connected hosts. As someone that builds software and has done for the past decade for people that have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 properties, there are lots of hosts that do have software also that just have a few units. My estimation is less than 40% of all Airbnb hosts and properties have software today. Less than 40%. I don't know the exact number, probably closer to 30%. Maybe I'm being optimistic by saying less than 40. But the overall point about saying that most hosts are very small is that most hosts don't have access to direct bookings in the first place. This isn't just about preventing direct bookings. I think it's because most of the Airbnb inventory doesn't even have a software that would allow them to operate a direct booking website. They don't really have means. They can take maybe a Venmo booking here and there, but it's not a serious threat for especially their unique inventory, as Arthur was saying, their platform, their direct to platform only inventory. It's kind of hard to get people to book via Venmo and things like that without a website. Now, maybe easier in the future as we get more used to that. But I think what's really happening here is Airbnb is trying to do probably 2 to 3 things at once. Number one, there is continued regulatory pressure from Europe on making sure that fees are consistent. This is what drove the fee transparency for them, about 4 years ago. And guess what? It increased the amount of bookings. And when they had when they discovered that listings that have fee transparency are typically make more than the delta in what they charge for the commission. So more than 15% more gross bookings for those fee transparent listings, even though those fees are all disclosed, right? So property managers said, hey, it's actually not bad to be fee transparent. I think similarly, we're going to find that having all the fees that are on Airbnb and could be charged as a part of a listing visible on a platform is a good thing for the industry. It's a good thing for the host, and it's probably a good thing for Airbnb too, that they can make more money on them. I think they're preparing to be as compliant as possible there is one. I think the second is they're also really preparing for their own, Arthur, you used the phrase walled garden, which is exactly how I think about Airbnb, and exactly the same phrase I use to describe them all the time. They want to own that ecosystem.
Yeah.
And if you don't have a transparent way of allowing people to create, publish, and collect their own fees in a consistent manner within that ecosystem without those people having to go buy software and having to have that software integrate the right way to Airbnb to make sure those fees are transparent again, it's way easier to say, guys, we're going to build our own fee platform and we're going to allow people to just set their own fees, which creates that transparency internally. And the third is probably a bit of saying, we know that people are leaving the platform they're going around. It may not be 20%, it may not be for 30%, but if it's 10% today and it was 5% yesterday, where's it going tomorrow?
Yeah.
Right. So how do we start nipping a little bit of this in the bud before it gets out of hand? Having said that, they have, as you guys have seen and we talked about already, the language is really narrow on exactly what they exclude in terms of being able to take a guest, give that guest a stay from the Airbnb platform and communication tools, and then build a relationship with that guest in the future and not move any bookings off, but build your own relationship with them.
So, and that's a good segue, Arthur, to a question that I think does affect your business directly, and I'm curious how you think about this, right? So, given sort of this language of anything on reservation, right? Which again is vague, which is nice. How do you see that playing into connecting to Wi-Fi, right? Filling out a StayFi form. How do you think? I mean, a lot of the operators in this space, or excuse me, the adjacent service providers in this space, the way that a lot of that contact information has historically been collected is through upsells, right? Like Mount was doing this for a while. There's several others, right, that give folks the opportunity to rent bikes or upgrade like to fully stock the fridge, et cetera. Like there are all these services that have popped up, and StayFi, kind of falls into that category of a service that's provided to folks while they're staying on site, being Wi-Fi, and obviously that being a primary lead acquisition for the SDR operator. How do you, I guess, wrestle with that language, thinking about StayFi and other businesses that quite frankly benefit from and really are reliant on capturing contact information during the stay?
Yeah, I mean, I think the policy just underlines what you should have been doing anyways, which is making sure you're collecting guest consent. Because as long as guests are consenting to being marketed to, I think you're totally in the clear, and you should be doing that anyways, because if you're not collecting consent, technically you shouldn't be marketing to them under just can spam in the US and other similar laws in other jurisdictions. So, um, you know, I don't really see, there's no changes in here around that issue at all. Like it's exactly the same as it was before. Um, yeah, so I don't see much of an issue there. And I don't think people necessarily need to be concerned about it. Um, yeah.
So and you're in this kind of unique position as well, because I mean, who doesn't want the Wi-Fi when they get to the home, right? And so that's maybe an easier thing to kind of think through. I'm sure in your checkbox, right, whatever, folks are opting into potential comms from the operator, et cetera. But for
I mean,
folks who, yeah, go
yeah,
ahead,
I'll just say we were always very intentional. Like we never wanted to build features that were dependent on Airbnb's integration or Airbnb's messaging, because if your service is dependent on sending a link in a message and
Yep.
then the guest is filling out a form, obviously Airbnb can turn on and off that at a moment's notice, right? So I think it's just for people to be cognizant, around, how do they want to interface with guests. I also think it's, if you actually read, I think another thing interesting about Airbnb's policies, if you look at how they define a guest, it's just the booker. So it's also
Mm,
interesting that their policy doesn't consider non-booking guests. They're not like included in this world that
mm,
they're even looking at, which obviously matters to hosts and operators.
that's interesting. So even if you
Yeah.
add 8 people to your reservation, it's technically only Zach.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of attention in the Airbnb's terms, because if you go
Yeah,
back to the hosting terms, it says you are entering a contract with a guest and
yeah,
you can operate your service in any way that you like, and you're not an affiliate or like, you know, an employee or related to Airbnb in any ways, right? So other than following all our terms.
yeah.
So Airbnb wants to kind of maintain maximal distance for obvious liability reasons, but then maintain as much control as they can. And that's the underlying tension throughout the whole terms of use in the Airbnb's policies.
Yeah, yeah. I want to go to you, Philip, on this question. So I had several people reach out who I have a lot of people on the show who are doing, one of a kind short-term rental stays, people that have built experiential hospitality brands, many of whom have like 1 or 2 units, right? And then more and more folks who I've been bringing on recently have 20, 30, 50. They're building boutique hotels as well. They started in short-term rentals and now they're in the boutique hotel space. One of the some of the concerns I've gotten from the folks who are rentalpreneurs, as you call them, with just a couple of units, is folks basically saying like, oh, I'm not going to be allowed to do X, Y, or Z anymore. So people, to your point, Arthur, they're not reading this as closely as they should be. They're seeing it as, oh, Airbnb is saying I can't promote my direct booking site. Never mind, I'm not going to make a direct booking site, right? And again, these are the folks who are typically, they've got full-time jobs. They're doing this on the side. They are not professional operators as we would define them here. And so maybe the argument is that this sharpened policy, if you will, is for the folks who've built the tree houses during COVID. They've had some success. They're now interested in sort of maybe building a brand, maybe doing a couple builds. That's when they start thinking about a PMS provider. That's when they start thinking about direct bookings. And this comes out, and again, without thorough reading, it just kind of sounds like, oh, I can't do this. Airbnb's cracking down. Never mind. Airbnb today is still 85% of my bookings. Like, don't bite the hand that feeds you, sort of thing, right? And so folks seem to be sort of like self opting out before even like giving this a critical read, which you could argue it was literally the point of the sharpening of this policy.
Yeah, I think you're 100% right, but I think this is a bit of a Streisand effect, right? Where
Mm,
by creating this policy with probably intending to have a chilling effect on people that are looking at building value off platform with Airbnb, things like this podcast are now happening. This community, this is a topic, just as you said, for everyone that's not in a lot of short-term rental communities. Every community is having a conversation like this right now, trying to piece together what this means. Maybe not with as much information as you're putting out here, but they're trying to sort this out. And it's creating more attention to the topic of, hey, hold on a second. If Airbnb is trying to hold on to this so firmly, maybe I should be looking at figuring out ways to push back on it.
mm,
Right. So
mm.
I think there is a blowback that's happening, intended or not, by Airbnb, or maybe they didn't have as much foresight in terms of this, as they didn't realize this was going to become as much of a hot topic as it did. Because I'm seeing the opposite, right? We create direct booking websites for hosts. We've created over 100,000 websites for hosts at FutureStay. And so we have a pretty good read because of the way that we work at volume. When spikes happen and people are really excited about creating direct booking websites, right? This
Yeah.
is one of those times that spikes are happening.
Mm,
People are starting to push back and saying, well, hold on a second. I should probably be looking at preserving my independence a little bit more. If this is what is coming down the pipe, if it's going to be more and more and more restrictive, then what else do I need to do to be able to make sure I'm in control of my business and not a third party?
yeah. Yeah. Interesting. Arthur, any reactions to the last few minutes?
Yeah, I think just two things. One is there's a regulatory angle, which is there is pushback, especially in the EU, but to some extent in the United States, of marketplace domination, where it's not, if you were to think about it, like because you have one transaction with a counterparty in a marketplace, you are now trapped by that marketplace to have all future transactions there. It just
Yeah.
doesn't make a lot of sense on its face. That would be like if you booked a Marriott on booking.com and booking.com told Marriott, you now must cancel their loyalty program and they must have all bookings on booking.com.
Yeah.
Like it's not a realistic outcome, and I don't think it would survive a lot of regulatory scrutiny. Definitely with some Digital Markets Act, which Airbnb may become uh, kind of more. They may like get, I forget the wording, but there's like a higher stage of regulation in the EU that they may become subject to soon. And the second is Airbnb is allowed to be totally arbitrary in its enforcement of its rules, which is something everyone should know. And your only recourse is like binding arbitration, even if you want to try to like sue them to get back on the platform. So, or however that would look. So it's like you don't have any power in this relationship, anyways. And there's no, if the policies are intentionally vague, then they can apply them in any way that they choose in the future. And you may or may not be subject to them. So, their enforcement is also just how can many of these even be enforced is questionable. Like who would be complaining and how would they know? And the second is if people do complain and you are banned or unfairly or fairly, you don't really have much recourse anyways. So, it's kind of up to people how much risk do they want to take on with some of these rules, I would say, and reading them as vaguely as they are written, what you want to do about them.
Yeah, I'd like to follow on to that point. So yeah, I think enforcement is an important topic here. I chatted with Airbnb about enforcement specifically, kind of asking how some of the policies, such as collecting of security deposits, et cetera, off the platform could be enforced. And they kind of just chuckled about it because the reality is they don't know if you're communicating outside of their actual messaging tools, which they have created a loophole for you to be able to do. And of course, you can certainly do once the guest is at your property. They don't know what's going on.
Yeah.
The reality here
Yeah.
is Airbnb has visibility into this if and only if a guest complains, if a guest has a bad experience, right? And so the reality here is use these tools for good and not for evil, and you're not going to end up having a ton of frustrated guests that are complaining to Airbnb about fees outside of the platform or ongoing marketing. So as Arthur said earlier, hey, make sure you're having guests opt into communications and marketing on a go forward basis instead of just grabbing as much contact information as possible and spamming them.
Yeah.
Make sure you're not holding key, amenities hostage by not letting them access unless they provide whatever sort of value you're looking for, contact information, et cetera. Doesn't mean you can't ask. It just means that maybe shouldn't be a requirement in order to, open the back gate or get whatever other service that you're looking for, right? As long as you follow those kind of simple common sense rules, these aren't going to bubble up as far as complaints, right? And I think Airbnb, I don't want to say I think, I know that they know that. They're very well aware of that. They're trying to maintain good guest experience in addition to everything else. And so, some of that is just the natural push and pull with having a third party in the relationship that's trying to enforce a standard.
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, I think where I would just push a little bit is, so I've been talking to some folks too who you used to be able to do, and some people, after I talked to a couple people about this, they sent me examples where this still exists. So maybe it's not fully cracked down on, or maybe it was just a select few people where this happened to, but basically people used to drop their Instagram handles right in their description. So like you could go and read about a property, you'd see the Instagram handle. Websites, were gone a long time ago, but you could see the Instagram handle. And then what savvy travelers were doing is they were just going looking up at the Instagram, finding the Instagram, and then oftentimes just booking direct through the website via the link in the bio, right? And now like those Instagram handles started getting removed from these descriptions, right? So Airbnb got savvy, right? They just wrote some script that basically removed anything with an at. Some people argue that theirs hasn't been affected yet. Some people are saying like it's affected in the description, but not in like the host bio anymore. So again, there does seem to be sort of this crackdown on wanting to prevent folks from moving off platform. And from Airbnb's
I would disagree with that a little bit, Zach. I mean,
please.
And here's the reason why I wouldn't call it a crackdown. You're right that that's happening. This has been a long war, right? In every single OTA.
Yeah.
We have to go back to, and Arthur's a bit younger than me, but he's been in the industry almost as long as I have, right? And you remember when Airbnb was only request to book. Every single communication required a conversation. This was before instant booking was a thing. Yep. And all the contact information was visible right there on the page, right? So you're going back to 2015, 16. We're at a stage where they and every other OTA has continued to try to force bookings to come through the platform for a variety of reasons, many of which make sense, and some of which are a little bit heavy-handed. But this isn't new, right? It's that same conversation about Instagram handles was previously about websites. And before it was about websites, it was about email addresses. And before it was about email addresses, it was about phone numbers, right? So that is the latest defensive move to try to prevent the newest form of communication. But that's been going on for literally almost a decade. So that's not new.
Yeah, and I think the tactic, right, is new. People get smart, and then Airbnb quickly follows through.
Right.
I guess though, what I'm really getting at is, and again, please, like maybe this is sort of a totally biased view here, or an overwhelmingly uneducated view because of, again, the people that I'm regularly communicating with, right? There does seem to the timing of all of this. I even think about the quote unquote loyalty program that they're testing with Hotel Tonight. If you package all of these together, from one perspective, I think you could make a solid argument that Airbnb is worried about professional operators, especially those who've done really great job at building brands, moving off platform in a significant way. Do you guys think that that's true? Do you think that they could care less about the mere cabins in Tennessee? And if the latter is true, then why crack down so much on people sharing their Instagram in their bios? Like, if they don't actually care, they don't see this as a huge threat, why revise this policy? Or
Right.
why make it public again in a meaningful way? Why all these quote unquote crackdowns? Why now?
I think they care a lot more about people that are initiating a booking process and then move off platform. And the same is true for Vrbo. Has very similar rules. I'd say also, if you look at the history of Airbnb, when it comes to like the brands, especially the traditional vacation rental brands, it's like really the other way around in terms of like those brands existed prior to Airbnb, and Airbnb had to go to property managers to convince them to onboard their properties onto the inventory. And that to me just shows, same with Hotel to Light, with the loyalty program, I just see Airbnb on the trajectory to become more like a booking.com. To me, they're just becoming more like a normal OTA, where their biggest advantages and walled moats are the unique inventory from individual hosts, which is a great service, and to their brand awareness of the fact that like so many of their bookings come like direct to app and direct to their website. But I don't think these are when it comes to like, these are just like minor fixes to try to prevent people from diverting. Where is it, compared to like the big picture of what Airbnb needs to worry about to, continue to please Wall Street and have good returns for their shareholders. I'm sure they're much more worried about how are they going to deal with AI or how they continue to grow inventory in Asia Pacific. I think like
Yeah.
this book direct, worried about small hosts having a website is like the 1,000th thing on their list of just normal compliance of we just want to make sure people are not easily diverting traffic to other websites. To me, it just
Yeah.
seems like a very minor part of their what they should be focused on, which is they need to find new markets to grow in and launch new product lines.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
That's
agree
the
with that. I think they're looking at this as this is leakage, right? This is if you're running the supermarket and you're just making sure people aren't putting, apples in their pocket on the way out.
yeah.
It's not a big shift in focus, I don't think. I think the only thing that is a little bit writing on the wall is I look at this and I look at honestly how narrow the language is
Mm,
and how specific and how much time they spend focusing on off platform fees. And I look at this as a precursor to a future services marketplace, which
yeah.
will allow them to yes, monetize more effectively. Yes, have more unique inventory. Those are good value props for a walled garden marketplace. The other is buyer and seller have this third party that is controlling everything in between them. So you really know exactly you're going to get what's on the tin,
Yeah.
right? So I think that's the third thing that is here. It's really shoring up that buyer seller relationship. I do think, look, I'm a really huge proponent of direct bookings. I'm a huge proponent of owning your customer data and the reality that regardless of whether or not that transaction was initiated, it is ultimately a customer. I just want to kind of remind all of us here that like if we operate, you kind of laid this out, Arthur, right? Airbnb had to go to the large operators and convince them to get on the platform. If you've ever been on the other side, the operator side of one of those conversations, here's how it typically goes. It goes like this. Hey, Zach, I'd like you to come list on my OTA. And you say, Phil, I don't need to list on your OTA. I'm doing 80% direct bookings today. Why would I list on your OTA with a 15 to 20% charge? I say, look, Zach, we're both business people here. Here's the reason, the real reason. We're going to probably put 1 million eyeballs on your listing over the next year. Not all of them are going to book direct. Some of them are going to Google the name of your business or your property and end up on your website. And some of them will book directly. That phenomenon is known as the billboard effect in travel. You can just Google it. It's not Airbnb specific. OTAs have been selling themselves like this to hosts and hotels for a decade. That's a known benefit of listing on an OTA that you're going to get more direct bookings. And so, yeah, they're trying to stem the tide a little bit, but that's also a part of their sales tactic to large hosts. And it has been the way that OTAs try to proposition large hosts for years. So, yes, of course, you're going to get more exposure. They are going to try to minimize it. It's, the Instagram handle, blocking is the latest salvo in a war that's been going on since the platform and other platforms like Verbo, et cetera, have existed.
Yeah.
I think the real war, the real one that could come is if they try to enforce pricing parity. That would be
Mm,
that's the one
mm,
that I'm waiting for because
mm.
that's the real one. That's the one the hotels have been through.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that'll be interesting if that ever comes, and how they can even enforce that, or they have the rights to, is questionable.
And so
Yeah.
that to that point, like they did, right? Like all STR OTA, like most regular hotel OTAs have pricing parity as part of your contract. Um, in the old contracts for STRs, going back 10 years when they first started building APIs to allow short-term rental owners and operators to use technology and connect, they had pricing parity clauses. They
Mm,
just never really enforced it. And again, the reason why is almost all inventory in the STR industry just doesn't have software. You
yeah.
can't really create parity without software. And so it's kind of an impossibility. It's very, very difficult to get someone who's doing this part-time to have the same price on two different channels.
Yeah.
And so, I hope they never go that far. I can say that in the world where, everyone is connected all the time and every booking is real time and you're listed on multiple channels, et cetera, everyone needs software to get there. Sure, I'd like to build that software for the entire industry, but not at the cost of rentalpreneurs not being able to have enough freedom and flexibility to do what they want, when they want, where they want, and to own their own guest.
That was a really good thought, Arthur. Philip, anything else? So Arthur's concerned about pricing parity. If there was a new policy to emerge that spooked you, or that would spook you beyond pricing parity, which I think is a great one, what would that policy be?
Yeah, I think the scariest policy I think would be one that mandates all guest communications, current, future, whatever, to go through the platform. And I think that a lot of people, when they read this the first time, or they consumed a little bit of information about it, but not quite enough, probably read this as that.
Yep.
And didn't realize that they were very clear carve outs. However, having said that, I think, and I think there's a little bit of a, we're in America, we have a kind of very revolutionary mindset all the time that's built into the DNA here, right? And so we think, oh, we're going to have an uprising against the evil empire and do X and Y and Z, whoever that evil empire is on that given day. I think, our industry is very beholden to Airbnb in many ways, especially at the side of the industry that I serve, right? The rentalpreneur side. And I think that things like that could go through and could change the shape of the way that we interact as an industry without a ton of recourse. So that sort of thing would scare me.
Do you guys think there's ever a world in which, because one of the things I always like to remind people of, especially professional operators who grew up, if you will, on Airbnb, so they didn't exist before, they weren't a veteran vacation rental manager. They got started in 2017, 2018, 2020, and today they're large, but they can thank Airbnb for that. And of course, their ability to execute well and build unique stays and all that fun stuff. But do you ever think that there's a, and sorry, my point being that these folks sort of have a very they're constantly, bitching, for lack of a better word, about Airbnb. And at the end of the day, you have to remind folks sometimes, like, hey, they brought you your first 1,000 bookings, or like your first, they're an incredible demand gen channel, and they elevated your brand. You were a featured treehouse in like their treehouse categories when categories rolled out. Like there's a lot of thank you Airbnb that I think is required. That said, right, do you ever think that there's a world in which Airbnb moves and accepts the fact that, hey, repeat bookings might take place off platform? Maybe there's a tax, maybe there's some sort of fee that you can pay, almost like an affiliate fee, a commission fee of some sorts on future bookings, that allow them to be a little more flexible with your communication. Is there a world in which that ever happens where, hey, first booking's got to come through us? If they do book again, and they do it, with your direct channels, as long as we have an API that's connected here and we see that, like, we won't charge you the 15%, but we're going to charge you 2%, 3% in perpetuity, or something like that. Do you see a world in which Airbnb shifts at all to allow for folks to maintain a more direct relationship with their guests?
I just think I think at a certain point they would just run up against regulatory issues. Like if you look at, like, I was reading about Apple versus Epic. Even though Apple kind of like mostly won that lawsuit, they did violate California's anti-steering law, which basically said that Apple was forced to allow Epic to like link out and tell consumers there were alternative ways of purchasing it for less. Same thing is true in the EU with their anti-steering laws. So there is a point at which a marketplace really shouldn't be allowed, I would say, shouldn't be allowed to monopolize all commerce, all future commerce to their application. And I think that would run against antitrust laws, both federally and in many states. Now, of course, like, who wants to adjudicate this if they went and did it? I mean, that'd be a whole fun exploration to see what would happen if they did move. But I think that at some point, the marketplace knows that they can't mandate all future commerce take place there.
Yeah. Especially when the
Vrbo
contract is between the guest and the host, to your earlier point, Arthur. Yeah.
Right. So Vrbo did this, I think, about 6 years ago. They did exactly what you're saying. They created a policy that required hosts to API connect to Vrbo via whatever PMS they were using. And Vrbo would reconcile the booking data against reservations that they saw starting on Vrbo to confirm essentially whether or not that booking transacted on Vrbo or if your guest details matched in some way. And two things happened. First, obviously, there was a massive public outcry. Now, Vrbo's base of business was tended a little bit more towards professional managers, despite the name, than Airbnb's did. So that was easier for them to consolidate kind of frustration and a voice against this. But the other thing that happened that actually prevented this from working is the PMS providers, like myself included, we all just refused to build to that feature. They can't make us build that feature, right, in mass, right? And we're not going to build that. And so there was no way for them to enforce it. And then it kind of quickly deprecated itself right out of the policy because the industry said no, right? My concern about Airbnb specifically, though, is that Airbnb hopefully in terms of why I would find a policy like that very scary in Airbnb. Airbnb has much more critical mass and ownership of a segment that doesn't really have a voice, that doesn't really have a small number of technology partners that act as the conduit between themselves and their channel. And so, could they get away with something like that? Maybe they'd get caught in regulatory, like Arthur says, quite possible. I don't know where that's going to be litigated. They would lose in the court of popular opinion. But if that's where 85 or 90% of your bookings are coming from, and you just signed took out a second mortgage, like what are you as the host going to do?
Yeah.
Right.
But the crazy thing, so I had to Google this again. So Airbnb right now in the EU is for being considered a quote unquote gatekeeper under the Digital Markets Act. If they get designated a gatekeeper, then my reading of the law is that hosts, we use that term loosely, Airbnb would be forced to allow hosts to tell folks in the app that there are alternative booking options that are cheaper, which would be very interesting to see if that actually happens. But I know Airbnb is fighting that designation, obviously, because they do not want to become designated a gatekeeper. I think in general, I'm really not that worried because I don't think it's feasible or enforceable, just like what happened with Vrbo, to basically say that once a guest books here, we own them forever, no matter what they want to do in the future.
Yeah, I think to that point, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, right? Like the reality is, while the policy I think is generally more crystallized, and a lot of people are hearing about this sort of policy for the first time, in some ways, specifically around capturing guest data, and now going from the broader concept of marketing down to a very, very narrow concept of moving reservations off the platform, one could read this as actually less protective for Airbnb against direct bookings. We're asking ourselves, why are they now announcing this policy? Another question is, what about the opposite question? Why are they making the policy narrower and more specific now? Is this
not a gatekeeper?
Is this to avoid the gatekeeper designation in Europe? Maybe so, right? It's definitely easier to get around the letter of the law now than it was.
Yeah. Very astute. I love that. It would be interesting, right? If that designation were to come through, I think it'd be the ultimate test of like brand and trust, right? So if it's not about price, right, and if it's like, well, I still feel safer, and if the price is $10 to $20 a night difference, right, do I still book through Airbnb because I trust?
I mean,
Airbnb?
I think that's why Airbnb is running as fast as can to how do we create value for guests and hosts other ways. Because I think they may realize that the marketplace walled moat where it may not be sufficient in the future, and they need to create value other ways, which is probably a good thing for consumers and businesses. So,
well, guys, I really appreciate you both taking time to come on and share your thoughts on all this. I think this has been a wildly fun, interesting conversation. Appreciate, again, the clarity. I think the quick kind of recap here is probably less things to be afraid of than folks might have thought into this. Don't panic. Read the policy, right? At the end of the day, this might be a more a benefit, a net benefit actually to your business than you might have otherwise thought. So, Arthur, Philip, thank you both for your time. Thank you for the work that you do for the industry, and we'll see you next time.
Sweet. Thanks, Zach.
Thanks for having us.
Hey friends, thanks for joining us for this episode of Behind the Stays. I'd love to know what you thought of the episode. Feel free to shoot me a DM on Instagram at Behind the Stays or send me an email at zach@joinjourney.com. If this is your first time tuning in, it's a pleasure to have you, and we hope to have you back again soon. But if you've been a listener for a while, I'd greatly appreciate if you'd subscribe to the show if you aren't already, and then leave us a rating and review of the show wherever you're streaming this podcast. Oh, and if you know a hotelier or a hospitality entrepreneur that's building something new and novel, I invite you to introduce them to me so that my team and I can discuss bringing them on the show. Again, you can just shoot me an email at zach@joinjourney.com or a DM on Instagram. Behind the Scenes is brought to you by Journey, a next-generation loyalty program built for the modern traveler. We're looking to onboard new boutique hotels, unique stays, and the top vacation rental management companies onto our platform every day. If you're a hospitality entrepreneur who has a stay or a collection of stays with soul, we'd love for you to apply to join our alliance at joinjourney.com/alliance. Again, that's joinjourney.com/alliance. Thanks for being here, y'all. We will see you next time.